Hey everyone, tonight we dim the lights, perhaps pull up a cozy blanket and prepare for a journey back in time, not to mighty empires or grand battles, but to the humble, often brutal reality of daily life in the medieval world. Specifically, we're going to pull up a seat, or rather a patch of dirt, and examine something you probably take for granted: lunch. Imagine, if you will, the year is roughly 1350, give or take a few decades, and you're not scrolling on your phone or grabbing a quick sandwich from the fridge. No, you are a peasant, a serf tied to the land, and your midday meal is about to be revealed. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern digestive system entirely intact, let alone your energy levels. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Knowing you're out there in all your different time zones makes this shared experience even more special. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our adventure begins not in a grand hall, but in the muddy, rutted tracks leading to a medieval village. You find yourself, dear listener, suddenly clad in coarse woolen clothing, a scratchy tunic, perhaps a simple cloak, draped over your shoulders. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth wood smoke from hearths and something vaguely animal. You notice the sun, still low, already casting long shadows across fields that stretch seemingly to the horizon. You're acutely aware of the chill in the air, a persistent dampness that seems to seep into your very bones. This isn't a romanticized view of the past. This is raw, unvarnished reality. As you instinctively raise a hand to shield your eyes from the weak morning sun, you realize something profound about your new existence. Your body already aches. Not from a gym workout, mind you, but from a lifetime of relentless physical exertion. Every muscle, every joint whispers a tale of constant strain. You are a peasant, a backbone of medieval society, though often unseen and unappreciated. Your life from dawn till dusk is dictated by the rhythms of the land and the demands of the manor. There's no weekend here, no sick days, no retirement plan. Just the ceaseless cycle of sowing, tilling, harvesting, and surviving. The immediate sensation you experience is a gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a deep hunger that isn't satisfied by the memory of a hasty morning bite. You recall that your breakfast was probably just a chunk of stale bread, maybe a spoonful of last night's leftover pottage, if you were lucky. Not the kind of fuel you'd expect to power a day of back-breaking labor. The ground beneath your rough, leather-bound feet feels cold, unforgiving, yet familiar. You see other figures equally stooped and silent already moving towards the fields, their breath misting in the cool air. The silence is profound, broken only by the distant bleating of sheep or the rustle of dry leaves. Your home, a small, humble hut thatched with straw, stands silent behind you. It's a single room shared with your family, maybe even a few chickens seeking warmth. The fire in the hearth, though, banked for the day, still holds a faint warmth, a memory of last night's meager supper. But there's no lingering scent of coffee, no comforting aroma of frying bacon. Just the lingering earthy smell of smoke and human habitation. Historians still argue whether the extreme simplicity of peasant life was a result of necessity or a reflection of spiritual austerity imposed by the church. As you trudge along, your mind, surprisingly clear despite the physical discomfort, begins to process the sheer scale of the day ahead. Fields of wheat, barley, and oats stretch before you, waiting for your muscle and sweat. The sun is barely up, and already your body craves sustenance, a real meal, to fuel the hours of relentless toil that lie ahead. The concept of lunch as a substantial, energizing meal, however, is about to be profoundly redefined in your new medieval reality. As you continue your slow, deliberate walk towards the fields, the gnawing hunger is a constant companion, a stark reminder of the relentless physical labor that defined a peasant's existence. Your hands, already calloused and rough, instinctively clench, anticipating the feel of the hoe handle, the scythe, or the heavy weight of a basket of stones. This isn't just about working out or getting steps in. This is about survival, pure and unvarnished. You quickly realize that a peasant's life was a perpetual cycle of strenuous physical activity. From dawn, sometimes even before until dusk, your body was your primary tool. There were no tractors, no automated irrigation systems, no electric lights to extend the workday. Every single task, from tilling the soil to harvesting crops, from mending fences to fetching water, was performed manually, relying on brute strength endurance and simple, often unwieldy tools. Imagine trying to plow a field the size of several football pitches with a wooden plow pulled by an ox day in and day out. It's a level of exertion that most modern individuals would find utterly debilitating after just a few hours. Your body, despite its youth for you in this scenario, are at the peak of your peasant prime, feels the cumulative effect of generations of such toil. You carry the subtle stoop of those who have spent their lives bent over the soil, the thickened joints of those who have lifted and carried heavy burdens. Even the simple act of breathing feels deeper, more rhythmic, fueled by a metabolic engine constantly burning fuel. It's an existence that demanded an incredible output of energy, far exceeding what many modern office workers or even most athletes expend in a typical day. A single misstep, a sprained ankle, or a persistent fever could spell disaster, as there was no safety net, no disability benefits, and no time off for recovery. You work or you don't eat, simple as that. Consider the diverse range of tasks. In spring, you'd be breaking ground, preparing furrows, and sowing seeds, each movement precise and repetitive. Summer brought the constant battle against weeds, the arduous chore of haymaking, and the endless fetching of water for thirsty crops or livestock. Then came autumn, the most demanding season of all harvest. You'd be bending, cutting, binding, and hauling for impossibly long hours, racing against the clock and the impending winter. Even winter, though seemingly a respite, involved chopping firewood, mending tools, caring for animals, and perhaps spinning wool. Still physically demanding, just different. Historians still argue whether the invention of specific farming tools or the development of crop rotation had a greater impact on the caloric output required of medieval peasants. This constant physical demand meant that every calorie consumed was critical. Food wasn't just about taste or enjoyment, it was fuel, pure and simple. Your stomach is a furnace that needs constant stoking, and the quality of that fuel directly impacts your ability to work and thus your ability to survive. You quickly learn that leisure as a concept barely exists. Any moment not spent toiling for the Lord or tending your small plot was spent on essential chores, grinding grain, gathering firewood, mending clothes. The very air around you seems to vibrate with the hum of unceasing human effort. So as you walk towards the fields, the crisp morning air chilling your face, you already understand why the medieval peasant's lunch, no matter how humble, was not just a meal. It was a lifeline. It was the essential bridge between the morning's exertion and the afternoon's continued grind, a critical injection of energy without which your body, already pushed to its limits, would simply give out. And what that lifeline consisted of, you're about to discover, is perhaps the most surprising part of all. With the physical demands of your medieval existence already keenly felt, your mind inevitably turns to the rumblings in your stomach. What exactly did a peasant consume as their meager morning's first fuel? Forget the concept of a full English breakfast or a smoothie. Your initial sustenance was dictated by necessity, availability, and the pressing need to get to work as quickly as possible. Imagine waking before dawn, the air inside your small smoky hut still heavy with the scent of last night's banked fire and the faint aroma of damp earth. There's no leisurely stroll to a pantry filled with options. Your breakfast is less a meal and more a perfunctory act of fueling. Most often it would consist of a chunk of our stale bread, often made from rye barley, or a mix of coarse grains incredibly dark and dense. This wasn't the fluffy artisanal sourdough you might enjoy today. This was hard, heavy bread designed to fill you up and provide slow-burning energy. You might even have to break off a piece with considerable effort, or perhaps dunk it in a bit of leftover liquid to soften it enough for chewing. It was a caloric baseline, nothing more. If you were particularly fortunate, or if there was a tiny bit left over from the previous night's supper, you might have a spoonful or two of pottage. This was a thick, gruel-like stew, the consistency of which varied wildly depending on what ingredients were available. It could be made from peas, beans, oats, or whatever vegetables were in season simmered down to a nearly indistinguishable mush. Having a bit of cold pottage to accompany your bread was a minor luxury, adding a few more calories and a hint of different nutrients. But it was far from a gourmet experience. It was simply more fuel. You can almost taste the blandness, a taste that would become profoundly familiar throughout your medieval life. Liquids were equally utilitarian. You wouldn't be sipping coffee or tea. Your drink, if any, would likely be ale or weak cider. Water, unless drawn directly from a known pure well and boiled, was often unsafe, teeming with unseen dangers. Ale, even weak ale, provided a source of hydration that was generally safer due or to the brewing process, and it offered a tiny caloric boost, albeit a very minor one. This was your hydrating beverage, your energy drink, and sometimes your only source of clean liquid for the day. Historians still argue about the precise alcohol content of daily medieval ale, with some suggesting it was often so low as to be barely intoxicating, making it more akin to a liquid bread. There was no time for elaborate cooking in the morning. The sun dictated your schedule, and when it rose, you needed to be in the fields. Preparing a complex meal would waste precious daylight hours that were needed for labor on the Lord's land or your own small strip. This emphasis on efficiency meant that the morning meal was kept incredibly simple, functional, and quick. It was a mere prelude to the demanding physical day ahead, just enough to ward off the most immediate pangs of hunger as you trudged out to the fields. So your morning's first fuel, a harsh introduction to the medieval diet, served its purpose to provide just enough energy to get you started to bridge the gap between sleep and the first hours of relentless toil. It was a testament to the sheer caloric demands of peasant life that even this meager fare was considered essential. And as the sun climbed higher, your body, already protesting from the early start and the meager intake, would begin to anticipate the next, slightly more substantial meal of the day lunch. With your meager morning fuel already a distant memory, you feel the sun beginning its slow ascent, its warmth, a welcome yet quickly draining presence on your back. The hours stretch before you, filled with the rhythmic grunt of effort and the dull ache of muscles. It's precisely at this point that you grasp the profound truth about the medieval peasant's midday sustenance. The luncheon's importance. This wasn't just a break in the day, it was the critical caloric bridge, the vital energy infusion that allowed your body to endure the relentless afternoon toil. Imagine being halfway through plowing a field, every muscle screaming in protest, sweat stinging your eyes. Your stomach is no longer just rumbling, it's a hollow cavern echoing with profound emptiness. This isn't the kind of hunger that a modern snack can fix. This is deep, pervasive hunger, the kind that saps your strength, blurs your vision, and threatens to bring you to your knees. Without a significant intake of calories at midday, your ability to continue working, and thus to meet your obligations to the Lord and feed your family, would simply evaporate. There were no energy bars, no quick coffee runs, just the promise of whatever humble fare awaited you at noon. The medieval day was often divided into distinct periods of labor, with a substantial break at midday. This break wasn't for socializing or relaxation, it was for refueling. The lunch, or more accurately, the dinner, the main meal for peasants, often eaten around noon, while the nobility ate their main meal later in the day, was designed to provide a sustained release of energy. It had to be filling, providing bulk and calorically dense, even if the ingredients themselves were simple. It was the largest meal of the day for many peasants, providing the necessary sustenance to push through the long afternoon of work. Unlike the fleeting morning bite, this midday meal might involve a brief respite from the immediate field, a chance to sit, even if only on a rock or a log, and consume something more substantial. The focus was entirely on functionality, providing enough carbohydrates for energy, some minimal protein, and whatever scant vitamins could be scrounged. A bad lunch meant a difficult afternoon, which could mean less produce, which could mean less food for tomorrow. It was a vicious, unforgiving cycle. You quickly learn that every mouthful is a strategic investment in your continued ability to function. Historians still argue about the precise timing and duration of the peasant's midday meal, as it likely varied significantly by region and season. The very concept of lunch as a lighter secondary meal is a relatively modern invention tied to shifts in working hours and urban living. For the medieval peasant, the midday meal was the linchpin of their daily survival strategy. It was when you replenished the glycogen stores that had been depleted by hours of physical exertion, when you tried to mend the wear and tear on your body. Without it, you simply couldn't keep going. So, as you feel the mid-morning sun climbing higher and the strain of your labor grows, the thought of that midday meal becomes a powerful, almost singular focus. It's not about culinary delight. It's about metabolic necessity. It's the essential pause, the critical replenishment, that allows you to face the unyielding demands of your medieval peasant existence. You are a human engine, and noon is when you finally get a chance to add more coal to the fire. The intense physical demands of your medieval morning slowly give way to the promise of the midday meal, and with it, a brief respite. You cease your labor wiping sweat from your brow with a calloused hand and instinctively make your way to a familiar spot. This is the noon in the fields. The humble, often exposed setting for a peasant's lunch, far removed from the comforts of a modern kitchen or even the smoky warmth of your own hut. Imagine the scene: a patch of ground at the edge of the cultivated field, perhaps beneath a solitary gnarled oak tree offering scant shade or simply exposed to the elements. There are no picnic blankets, no portable tables, and certainly no climate control. In spring, the ground might be damp and cool, the air still carrying the bite of winter. In summer, the sun beats down relentlessly, baking the earth and sending shimmering heat waves across the crops. In autumn, the air might be crisp, hinting at the coming cold, or thick with dust from the harvest. You learn to make do with whatever nature provides. Your fellow laborers, equally weary, gravitate towards the same spot. There's a quiet camaraderie, a shared understanding of the morning's exertion and the afternoon's looming demands. Conversation, if any, is minimal, focused on the immediate task of refueling. This isn't a social hour, it's a pragmatic necessity. You might see a few rough wooden benches or logs, but more often you simply sit on the bare earth, perhaps on a sack or a folded piece of cloth, if you're lucky enough to have one. The sounds are those of the countryside, the chirping of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the tall grain. You are utterly immersed in your environment, deeply connected to the land that provides your meager sustenance. The meal itself is typically brought from home, packed in a simple cloth bag or a small wooden bowl. There are no insulated containers, no fancy lunch boxes. The food is eaten cold, often having been prepared the previous evening or early that morning. The lack of cutlery means you're relying on your fingers, perhaps a small, ever-present knife tucked into your belt for cutting. This isn't about cleanliness, it's about efficiency and practicality. You eat quickly, mindfully aware that every bite is fuel for the hours ahead. Historians still argue about the precise rituals surrounding peasant mealtimes, with some suggesting a brief communal prayer was common before eating. The setting, though, basic highlights the stark realities of peasant life. You are eating where you work, a constant reminder of your bond to the land, and the lord who owns it. There's no escaping the sights, sounds, or smells of the fields. The dust from the soil, the buzzing of insects, the scent of damp earth and growing plants. These are the aromas that accompany your meal. It's a sensory experience far removed from the controlled environments we inhabit today. So as you take your humble seat on the ground, perhaps leaning against a rough fence post, you truly understand the raw simplicity of noon in the fields. It's a moment of essential refueling, a brief pause in the relentless cycle of labor utterly unadorned by comfort or ceremony. And what exactly you unwrap from your cloth, the core components of this vital midday meal, is a story that will begin to reveal the true limitations of surviving on a medieval peasant's lunch. As you settle onto the rough earth, your gaze immediately falls upon the contents of your simple cloth bag, or perhaps a small lidded wooden bucket. The undisputed king of the medieval peasant's lunch, and indeed of their entire diet, quickly becomes apparent. Bread, the staff of life in its most unvarnished essential form. This wasn't just a side dish, it was the main event, the caloric backbone, the very foundation upon which survival rested. Imagine a loaf that is nothing like the airy, soft white bread you might find in a modern supermarket. This medieval bread is dense, heavy, and often dark, a testament to the grains from which it was made. It's likely crafted from yeast rye barley oats, or a mix of these, sometimes with coarser, less refined wheat, if the harvest was particularly good and you were fortunate enough to live in a region that grew it. The bran and germ were usually left in making it incredibly fibrous and hearty, but also very rough on the palate and digestive system. You might even spot flecks of unground grain or husks, remnants of a less precise milling process. This bread was designed for sustenance, not delicate flavor. The texture. Imagine something akin to a very dense, dry brick. It's hard enough that you might struggle to tear off a piece, with your fingers often resorting to your ever-present knife to saw off a manageable chunk. Chewing it requires significant effort, and it feels like it expands in your mouth slowly, thoroughly, filling you up. This density was precisely its purpose, to provide a slow-burning source of carbohydrates that would release energy steadily throughout the long, arduous afternoon in the fields. It was the original slow-carb diet by necessity, not by choice. Bread was consumed at virtually every meal in vast quantities. For lunch, it might be eaten plain or perhaps dipped into a bit of thin broth, if any was available. There were no spreads like butter or jam. Those were luxuries, nor was there often any accompanying protein or fat to soften its dryness. It was just bread, pure and simple, but absolutely vital. A peasant might consume several pounds of this coarse bread in a single day, forming the overwhelming majority of their caloric intake. Historians still argue about the precise ratios of different grains used in peasant bread across various regions of medieval Europe, as local availability heavily influenced its composition. This bread was often baked at the lord's communal oven for a fee, or sometimes in crude ovens built within the village. The baking process itself was essential, making the grains palatable and digestible, and the resulting loaf would be hard on the outside, preventing quick spoilage. You learn quickly that every crumb is precious, nothing is wasted. Stale bread could be repurposed into crumbs for thickening pottage or softened with water for another meal. It was the ultimate resilient food. So as you tear into your piece of this heavy dark bread, you understand that this isn't just food. It's your very lifeline. It's the tireless worker fueling the tireless worker, the relentless carbohydrate pushing you through another day of physical exertion. Without this fundamental core staff of life, survival in the medieval world would simply be impossible. It is the cornerstone of your peasant's lunch, preparing you for the next equally ubiquitous component of your midday meal. With a sizable chunk of dark, dense bread already making its slow, deliberate way through your digestive system, your focus shifts to the other ubiquitous companion in your medieval lunch. Pottage, the staple. This humble, often bland and endlessly adaptable stew was the second pillar of the peasant diet, a communal dish that provided warmth, hydration, and a surprising amount of bulk, though rarely much excitement for the palate. Imagine a thick, often lukewarm concoction ladled from a wooden bowl that you might have carried from home. This isn't the rich, hearty stew you might conjure from a modern cookbook. Pottage was by definition a long-simmered mixture of grains, legumes, and whatever seasonal vegetables were available. Its consistency could range from a thin gruel barely thicker than soup to a dense, almost solid mush, depending on the cook's generosity or scarcity of ingredients and the time of year. You'd find no chunky pieces of meat or clearly defined vegetables here. Everything was usually cooked down to a soft, almost indistinguishable texture. The core ingredients of peasant pottage were typically oats, barley, or dried peas and beans. Jep. These were incredibly cheap, easy to store, and provided the necessary carbohydrates and some protein. These were slowly simmered for hours, sometimes overnight, allowing them to break down and become easily digestible. If you were lucky, a few foraged herbs might be tossed in for flavor, or perhaps some wild garlic if it was the right season. The primary flavor profile, however, would be earthy, starchy, and subtly savory, often enhanced only by the long cooking process itself. You can almost feel the warm, thick liquid coating your tongue, a truly comforting sensation in the chill of the fields. The adaptability of pottage was its greatest strength. In spring, it might incorporate young nettles or wild greens. In summer, peas and beans from your garden would swell its volume. In autumn, root vegetables like carrots or turnips, if you had them, might find their way into the pot. Even in winter, dried peas and beans, carefully rationed, would form the base. This meant that while the core elements remained constant, the subtle nuances of flavor and texture would shift with the changing agricultural year. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on pottage was purely out of necessity or also influenced by a perceived health benefit of easily digestible boiled foods. Pottage was also a communal dish. It was often cooked in a large cauldron over an open fire in the home, and then portioned out for the family's meals throughout the day. For lunch in the fields, you might share a bowl with your family members, each taking turns to scoop a spoonful. There was no concept of individual portions or specialized diets. Everyone ate the same thing day in and day out. This shared experience underscored the collective nature of peasant life. So as you scoop a spoonful of this warm, thick pottage, you understand that it's more than just a meal. It's a testament to survival resilience and adaptability. It's the bland yet utterly vital partner to your coarse bread together, forming the unyielding foundation of your medieval peasant's lunch, propelling you forward into the relentless afternoon ahead. As you spoon the last of the pottage into your mouth, a stark reality of the medieval diet becomes painfully clear. Seasonal scarcity dictated every bite. Your ancestors didn't have year-round access to fresh produce from across the globe. Their meals were a direct reflection of what the earth yielded, when it yielded it, and what little could be preserved. The variety to your modern palate is almost non-existent. Imagine living in a world where your diet fundamentally transforms with the turning of the calendar. Intronos. Spring. After the long, lean winter, you'd greet the first shoots of wild greens like nettles, dandelions, or young garlic with immense relief. These might be chopped into your pottage or eaten raw for a burst of much-needed vitamins. Any overwintered root vegetables like parsnips or carrots that survived in the ground would also be a welcome addition, though likely soft and past their prime. The arrival of fresh eggs from hens as days lengthened would also provide a rare and valuable source of protein, perhaps even making a fleeting appearance in your humble lunch. Summer brought a slightly more diverse, though still limited, bounty. This was the season for peas, beans, onions, and cabbage from your small garden plot. These would swell the volume of your pottage, adding freshness and fiber. Wild berries, if you were lucky enough to find them and brave enough to forage, might offer a rare burst of sweetness quickly consumed before they spoiled. But even in summer, the focus was on staple crops, like grains and legumes, which still formed the vast majority of your intake. You wouldn't find a vibrant summer salad on your lunch plate. The idea of raw, fresh variety as a main course was simply not feasible. Chandu. Autumn was the season of hard work, and if the harvest was good, a temporary increase in food availability. This was when grains were brought in and efforts were made to preserve what little could be stored for the coming winter. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, if grown, would be harvested, and some might be stored in cool cellars or pits. Apples, if you had an orchard or access to wild trees, would be gathered, some eaten fresh, others dried for later. This was the time for strategic food storage, ensuring enough grain and dried legumes to last until spring. You can almost feel the urgency in the air, the desperate race against the clock to gather every last bit before the cold set in. But then came winter, the season of scarcity and hardship. Your diet would shrink back to its most basic elements: dried grains, mostly as bread and pottage, dried peas and beans, and whatever root vegetables had successfully stored. Fresh produce was a distant memory. Any preserved meats, salted or smoked, were precious and reserved for the Lord, or special occasions, certainly not for a peasant's daily lunch. This was the time of greatest caloric deficit, when hunger was a constant gnawing presence. Historians still argue whether the consistent caloric deficit in winter contributed more to disease and mortality than outbreaks of plague. This relentless cycle meant that while you had access to some variety throughout the year, each season brought its own rigid limitations. There were no imported fruits or vegetables from distant lands, no heated greenhouses to produce tomatoes in December. Your survival depended entirely on the earth's rhythm, making your peasant's lunch a stark reflection of nature's dictates. With the stark realities of seasonal scarcity firmly ingrained in your mind, your attention inevitably shifts to what for a modern palate is a fundamental component of almost every meal: money. Meat, a rare treat. For the medieval peasant, the consumption of actual animal flesh was an exceptional event, a fleeting luxury that underscored their place at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Your peasant's lunch, with very few exceptions, would have been entirely devoid of it. Imagine your surprise when you realize that the rich, protein-laden stews and roasted joints you associate with medieval feasts were utterly beyond your daily grasp. Meat, whether from cattle, pigs, sheep, or fowl, was an incredibly valuable commodity. It represented not just sustenance, but wealth, status, and labor. Raising animals required land fodder and protection, resources primarily controlled by the lord of the manor. When animals were slaughtered, their meat was destined for the Lord's table or sold in markets to the wealthier townspeople. For a peasant, consuming meat was typically limited to very specific, infrequent occasions. Perhaps a pig might be slaughtered once a year. By the village community, with each family receiving a small, carefully rationed portion. This would be salted or smoked to preserve it through the winter, a precious and highly anticipated addition to the diet. Even then, your share would be lean, often the less desirable cuts, and consumed sparingly, perhaps only a few ounces at a time, stretched across many meals. You can almost feel the dry, intensely salty taste of a cured pork scrap, a flavor to be savored slowly. Wild game, while theoretically available in the forests, was usually protected by the Lord's hunting rights. Poaching was a serious offense, carrying severe penalties that could include mutilation or even death. So while you might occasionally dream of a plump rabbit or a forest deer, actually catching and consuming one was a dangerous fantasy, not a realistic food source for your lunch. Even poultry like chickens or geese, if kept by a peasant, were primarily valuable for their eggs or for breeding, not for their meat. A chicken might only be eaten if it was old and no longer laying, or if a very special occasion warranted its sacrifice. Fish, if you lived near a river or stream that wasn't overly controlled by the Lord, might offer a slightly more frequent, though still inconsistent source of protein on fast days. But even then, it was often small, bony freshwater fish, far from a plentiful catch. Historians still argue whether the occasional poaching by desperate peasants was more widespread than official records suggest, given the severe penalties. So, as you finish your bread and pottage, the absence of meat on your peasant's lunch is a stark reality. It highlights the immense caloric and protein deficit that many peasants lived with daily. Your body, constantly burning energy through labor, was rarely adequately replenished with the dense protein that meat provides. This continuous lack of high-quality protein contributed significantly to the chronic fatigue and vulnerability to disease that characterized peasant life. You learn that in this world, meat isn't just food, it's power, and it's almost entirely out of your reach. Having resigned yourself to the near-total absence of meat from your midday meal, you might then cast a hopeful glance for another common modern food group. Dairies Limited. Roll. Chowdate. Prepare for another disappointment for milk cheese and butter, while present in the medieval world, were rarely a significant or even consistent part of a peasant's daily lunch. Imagine the sparse offerings on your wooden platter. While you might occasionally see cows, goats, or sheep grazing in the communal pasture, their milk production was often seasonal and primarily directed elsewhere. Milk, when available, was typically consumed fresh and quickly, as refrigeration was non-existent. It would sour, rapidly making it difficult to store or transport for a midday meal in the fields. A peasant child might get a little fresh milk in the morning, but for an adult laborer at noon it was a rarity. You wouldn't be pouring it over oats, for example, as a regular part of your diet. Cheese. While a good way to preserve milk was often produced on a small scale, mostly for immediate family consumption or for payment to the Lord. The cheese that was made by peasants was typically hard, robust, and aged for preservation, far from the creamy, delicate varieties we enjoy today. If a peasant did have cheese, it would be a precious, carefully rationed commodity, perhaps a small hard chunk gnawed on in the evening, rather than a regular accompaniment to lunch. It was a caloric and protein boost, but one too valuable to be consumed carelessly. You can almost feel the dense, salty texture of a medieval peasant cheese, a taste far stronger than anything you're used to. Butter was even rarer. While cream could be churned into butter, it was highly perishable, and like cheese, often produced in small quantities. Any excess might be sold at market to supplement meager incomes or used sparingly by the peasant family for special occasions. It certainly wasn't slathered on bread as a regular part of your midday meal. Fats in the peasant diet were more likely to come from lard if a family had managed to keep and slaughter a pig, and even then, these were precious resources. Historians still argue whether the limited dairy consumption contributed significantly to specific nutrient deficiencies in the peasant population beyond general caloric and protein deficits. The reasons for this limited dairy consumption were manifold. Firstly, the animals themselves were valuable. Their milk was a byproduct of their primary roles: labor oxen, wool sheep, or meat pigs, occasionally cows. Secondly, processing and preserving dairy products required time, skill, and often specific equipment that not all peasant families possessed. And finally, much of what was produced often went to the Lord as feudal dues, further limiting the peasant's own access. So as you pick at your dry bread and unadorned pottage, the absence of familiar dairy products is yet another stark reminder of the constraints of your medieval diet. There's no creamy cheese, no refreshing milk, no rich butter to enhance your meal. Your body, constantly burning energy through labor, was sustained by the most basic and enduring of foods, relying on the sheer bulk of grains and legumes rather than the richness of animal products. Having noted the scarcity of dairy and meat, you might think a peasant's diet was simply a matter of what they could grow. But a powerful unseen force exerted profound influence over every mouthful. Fasting's firm grip. The medieval church, with its intricate calendar of holy days, imposed rigorous fasting requirements that dramatically shaped what and when a peasant could eat, often pushing their already meager diet to its absolute limits. Imagine a world where your daily sustenance wasn't just dictated by harvest and hunger, but by divine decree. The medieval Christian calendar was peppered with fast days. Not just Lent before Easter, but also Advent before Christmas Ember Days, 4 sets of 3 days dedicated to prayer and fasting, and every Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday throughout the year. On these days, the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs was strictly forbidden. You see, fasting wasn't about abstaining from all food, but from certain types of food, particularly those derived from animals that walked on land. Fish, by contrast, was often permitted, leading to the bizarre culinary notion that beavers and puffins, which spent time in water, could also be eaten on fast days. You can almost feel the spiritual weight of these regulations, a constant reminder of piety. For the wealthy, fasting might mean a lavish meal of expensive freshwater fish, fine wines, and elaborate vegetable dishes. For the peasant, however, it meant pushing their already limited diet to an even more austere extreme. Your lunch on a fast day would consist of even more bread and pottage. But with a crucial difference: no possibility of even a tiny scrap of dried meat, no accidental drop of milk, and certainly no eggs. It was simply the bare minimum. The pottage would be made entirely from grains and legumes, perhaps seasoned only with salt, and the most basic of herbs, if any. This constant oscillation between slightly more varied non-fast days and severely restricted fast days meant that peasants often faced prolonged periods of protein and fat deficiency. While they might get a small boost from eggs or very rare meat scraps on non-fast days, these gains were often undone by the demands of numerous fasting periods. The body, constantly expending energy, struggled to recover. Historians still argue whether the Church's fasting rules inadvertently contributed to chronic malnutrition among the peasantry, or simply formalized dietary practices already largely dictated by economic necessity. The psychological impact of these restrictions was also significant. Imagine being desperately hungry after hours of labor, knowing that even the slim chance of a small piece of cheese or a bit of lard was forbidden by religious observance. It instilled a profound sense of discipline and piety, but also undoubtedly added to the daily hardship. The act of eating became imbued with religious significance, a constant test of faith and obedience. So as you pick at your particularly sparse midday meal on a medieval Friday, you feel the firm grip of fasting, a powerful and unwavering force that shaped every aspect of a peasant's diet. It wasn't just about what you could afford or grow. It was about what God commanded, leaving you with even less to fuel your relentless struggle for survival. With the strictures of fasting ever present, you turn to the liquid refreshment accompanying your meager lunch. Forget clean bottled water. For the medieval peasant, the brewed beverage, specifically ale or weak cider, was the universal and often safest choice for hydration. This wasn't a recreational drink, it was a fundamental part of daily caloric intake and a critical measure against disease. Imagine raising a rough, unglazed earthenware mug to your lips. The liquid inside is thick, slightly cloudy, and often lukewarm, carrying an earthy, malty aroma. This is ale, the lifeblood of the medieval peasant. It was brewed from barley, oats, or other available grains, and its production was a constant chore in every household. Unlike modern beer, it often contained little or no hops, which means it spoiled faster and had a different flavor profile. Less bitter, more sweet and grainy. The strength varied wildly. For daily consumption, especially during work hours, it was typically small ale, or table beer, a very weak brew with a low alcohol content, often less than 1 to 2%. This made it a safer alternative to water, as the brewing process boiling the water during mashing and fermentation killed most harmful bacteria. You can almost feel the reassuring slightly thick texture of the ale as it quenches your thirst. If you lived in a region where apples were plentiful, such as parts of England or France, cider might be your primary drink. Similar to ale, peasant cider was often unfermented or very weakly fermented, a small cider brewed for daily consumption rather than intoxication. It provided hydration and a few calories, and like ale, the boiling and fermentation processes made it generally safer than raw water. Historians still argue about the precise caloric contribution of these beverages to the overall peasant diet, as it varied significantly by region and brewing practices. This constant consumption of ale or cider meant that medieval peasants were rarely truly drunk. The low alcohol content was designed to hydrate and provide energy without impairing judgment or ability to work. It was essentially liquid bread, a caloric supplement that was palatable and safer. You would drink it throughout the day in the fields at home, children included, though theirs would be even weaker. The communal nature of brewing, often done by the women of the household, also highlights its central role in daily life. The quantity consumed was astonishing by modern standards. A peasant might drink a gallon or more of small ale a day, especially during periods of heavy labor. This was their primary source of liquid, and it significantly contributed to their daily caloric intake, sometimes making up a noticeable percentage of their overall energy. It also provided some vitamins and minerals, a subtle but vital contribution to a diet that was often lacking in micronutrients. So, as you lift your mug of ale or cider to your lips, you understand that this brewed beverage is more than just a drink. It's a vital component of your survival strategy. It's a safer source of hydration, a modest caloric boost, and a constant comforting presence in your unyielding day. It underlines the ingenious if limited ways in which medieval peasants managed to sustain themselves against immense odds. Having quenched your thirst with a hearty swig of ale, you quickly realize why it was the preferred beverage over what seems like the most natural choice. You ponder secta. Water's dangers. In the medieval world, understanding that fetching a cool, clear glass from the tap was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Drinking unboiled, unpurified water was often a risky gamble, a potential gateway to illness and even death. Imagine encountering a bubbling brook or a village pond. While tempting, especially on a warm day, you instinctively know better than to simply cup your hands and drink. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated. Rivers and streams, which served as sources of drinking water, also carried waste from upstream settlements, animal carcasses, and runoff from agricultural fields. Village wells, while seemingly cleaner, could still be tainted by nearby cesspits, animal enclosures, or shallow ground seepage. The idea of sanitation, as we understand it, was largely absent, and the link between contaminated water and disease was poorly understood, if at all. You can almost feel the instinctive aversion to murky, stagnant water. The invisible enemies lurking in untreated water, bacteria, viruses, and parasites, were rampant. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were common scourges, often sweeping through communities with devastating effect. A sudden bout of severe diarrhea could incapacitate a peasant for days, making labor impossible and threatening their very survival. Without access to modern medicine, such illnesses were often fatal, particularly for the young, the old, or those already weakened by malnutrition. The constant threat of waterborne disease was a silent, persistent shadow over peasant life. Historians still argue whether poor water quality or inadequate diet was the primary cause of early medieval infant mortality. This constant threat explains why brewing became so fundamental to daily life. The process of boiling water during brewing, along with the fermentation, effectively killed most of the harmful pathogens. While not a perfect solution, it significantly reduced the risk compared to drinking directly from a questionable source. Even for cooking, water would often be boiled for pottage inadvertently making it safer. You'd learn to trust the ale in your mug far more than the water in the stream. Collecting and managing clean water was also a significant daily chore. Fetching water from a distant reliable spring or a deeper well required time and effort, often carried in heavy wooden buckets. This precious resource would then be carefully rationed for drinking and cooking further, cementing its value and the understanding that it needed to be made safe before consumption. So, as you swallow the last mouthful of your ale, you fully comprehend why the medieval peasant viewed water with a healthy dose of suspicion, and why it rarely, if ever, formed the basis of their midday refreshment. The simple act of quenching your thirst was fraught with danger, making the fermented alternative not a luxury, but a necessity, a crucial element in your struggle for survival against the invisible perils of the medieval world. With your thirst satisfied by a safe, if rather bland ale, your senses are now heightened to the subtle nuances of your medieval surroundings. You begin to understand that survival wasn't just about cultivating crops. It was also about exploiting every available resource, leading you to the practice of more. Foraging for flavor. In a diet otherwise monotonous, wild plants and berries offered rare bursts of freshness, vitamins, and even a fleeting hint of sweetness. Imagine yourself walking along the edge of the forest or by a hedgerow, your eyes keenly scanning the undergrowth. This isn't a leisurely nature walk. It's a constant search for edible additions to your meager meals. In spring, your attention might be drawn to the tender young shoots of los nettles, which, when boiled into your pottage, lose their sting and provide a much-needed dose of vitamins that were absent from your winter diet. Or perhaps you'd spot wild garlic, amarn, or onions, their pungent leaves offering a sharper flavor to an otherwise bland stew. You can almost feel the rough texture of a nettle leaf before it's boiled, knowing it will soon be a vital green. As summer approached, the landscape would offer different treasures. Wild berries. Blackberries, raspberries, or blueberries, depending on your region, would become a highly anticipated, albeit brief, luxury. These wouldn't be consumed in vast quantities. A small handful might be a precious treat, savored slowly, offering a rare burst of natural sweetness and much-needed antioxidants. You'd also look for wild apples, obuefos, or montpears, often smaller and more tart than cultivated varieties, but still valuable. These might be eaten fresh or, if plentiful, dried for later consumption, a foresight born of desperate necessity. Historians still argue whether the consistent intake of foraged wild plants, even in small amounts, significantly impacted peasant health or merely provided psychological relief from dietary monotony. Mushrooms. Too, were a potential source of sustenance, though foraging for them carried obvious risks. Only those with deep inherited knowledge of local flora and fungi could safely distinguish edible varieties from poisonous ones. This knowledge was passed down through generations, a critical survival skill. A good mushroom haul could add significant flavor and substance to a pottage, but a single mistake could be fatal. The subtle scent of damp earth and hidden fungi would accompany these perilous hunts. Beyond the immediate consumption, some foraged items could be used for basic flavoring or even medicinal purposes. Wild herbs like thyme mint or marjoram, if identified and gathered, could subtly transform the taste of a gruel. These weren't spices, mind you, but simple earthy enhancements. Every wild edible plant, no matter how humble, represented a victory against the relentless monotony and nutritional deficit of peasant life. So as you keep a vigilant eye on the hedgerows and forest edges during your midday break, you understand that foraging isn't just a quaint historical detail. It's a crucial, dangerous, and sometimes rewarding practice that added vital nutrients and fleeting moments of flavor to a diet teetering on the edge of survival. It underlines the intimate, often desperate relationship medieval peasants had with their immediate natural environment. Beyond the wild bounty of foraged goods, you turn your attention to the small patch of land you call your own, a tiny rectangle of earth that provides another crucial yet limited supplement to your diet, your garden's bounty. R. While the Lord's fields demanded most of your labor, this small, intensively cultivated plot was your personal safeguard against utter monotony and deeper hunger. Imagine crouching down your fingers, sifting through the dark, rich soil of your small kitchen garden. This isn't a sprawling vegetable patch. It's likely a compact area, perhaps just a few square yards nestled near your hut. Every inch of it is precious and carefully tended, coaxed to yield as much as possible. You are a master of intensive cultivation, maximizing every seed and every drop of water. The vegetables you grow are hardy, high-yielding, and storable. Cabbage is a ubiquitous sight, its tough leaves providing bulk and some vitamins. It can be eaten fresh if available, or more likely chopped and added to your ever-present pottage. Onions and leeks are also common, offering pungent flavor and, crucially, a degree of preservation. These could be hung to dry or stored in cool, dark places for a time. You can almost smell the sharp, earthy aroma of freshly pulled onions as you chop them for your evening meal. Root vegetables. Like turnips and parsnips, if your soil permitted, were invaluable. They could be left in the ground for longer into the colder months or stored in simple root cellars or pits, providing a vital source of calories and fiber during the lean winter. Carrots, while known, were often tougher and paler than modern varieties, more for substance than sweetness. These were hardy, robust vegetables designed to withstand difficult conditions and provide maximum yield from minimum space. Historians still argue whether the commonality of specific root vegetables in peasant gardens was more a matter of ease of growth or their superior storage capabilities. Peas and beans. Particularly dried varieties were central to your garden's output. These legumes provided crucial protein when meat was absent, and their dried form meant they could be stored for months, forming the backbone of your winter pottage. You'd spend hours shelling peas or threshing beans, knowing that each tiny legume was a direct investment in your family's survival. The gentle rustle of dry pea pods as you gathered them would be a comforting sound. Fruit trees, if you were lucky enough to inherit or tend one on your small holding, would be a rare and valuable asset. An apple or pear tree could provide a brief bounty in autumn, some of which might be eaten fresh, but much would be dried or processed for longer storage. These would be small tart fruits, far from the sugary sweetness of modern orchard varieties, but precious nonetheless. This garden, though small, represents your limited autonomy, your direct connection to sustenance beyond the Lord's fields. It's where you pour your extra labor, knowing that every cabbage head, every dried pea, is a small victory against hunger. It emphasizes that while your lunch was largely dictated by the bulk of bread and pottage, your personal garden offered vital, albeit small, contributions to its sustenance and occasionally even its flavor. As you consume the meager contents of your garden's bounty, perhaps a few tough cabbage leaves in your pottage, you become acutely aware of another critical, yet often scarce element: the salt solution. For the medieval peasant, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a vital preservative, a tool for survival and a commodity whose limited availability profoundly shaped their diet and their very well-being. Imagine living in a world where your food, especially any surplus, quickly spoils. Without refrigeration, salt was paramount. It was the primary method for preserving meat, fish, and even some vegetables for the lean months of winter. A salted piece of pork, dried hard and crusted with salt, was a lifeline, providing crucial calories and protein when fresh food was unattainable. The salt drew out moisture, inhibiting bacterial growth and allowing food to be stored for extended periods. You can almost feel the gritty texture and intense salinity of a piece of cured fish, a taste that was simultaneously a harsh reality and a comforting sign of stored sustenance. However, salt was often expensive and tightly controlled. Inland peasants far from coastal salt pans or natural salt mines would find it a costly commodity. It was a trade good subject to taxes and levies, making it a luxury rather than an everyday abundance. A peasant might only be able to afford enough salt for essential preservation, meaning their daily pottage and bread were often seasoned very sparingly, if at all. This lack of seasoning would make an already bland diet even more monotonous to a modern palate. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of salt contributed to specific nutrient deficiencies beyond what was directly provided by the food itself. The limited access to salt also impacted health. Humans need sodium to regulate bodily functions, and hard-working peasants sweating profusely in the fields would constantly be losing essential salts. Without adequate replenishment, they could suffer from fatigue, muscle cramps, and even more severe health issues. The subtle but constant craving for salt would be an underlying sensation, a bodily need, constantly just out of reach. You might try to salvage every last bit of salt from salted meats by boiling them down, diluting the precious flavor. Beyond preservation, salt was occasionally used in small amounts for flavor, particularly in making bread more palatable or adding a kick to bland pottage. But this was a careful, measured addition, unlike the free shaking of a modern salt shaker. Every crystal was valuable. The process of making cheese also required salt, another reason why that particular dairy product was often carefully rationed. So, as you chew your unseasoned bread, you understand that salt was a powerful force in the medieval world, shaping culinary practices, trade routes, and even health. Its scarcity meant that your peasant's lunch, while providing bulk, often lacked the simple, essential seasoning that we take for granted, making it even more of a test of endurance than you might initially imagine. With the omnipresent taste of blandness occasionally alleviated by a scarce touch of salt, you become acutely aware of another far more exotic absence from your peasant's lunch deck. Spices, Lord's domain. The aromatic, flavorful spices that define much of modern cuisine were for the medieval peasant utterly beyond reach, reserved exclusively for the wealthy elite who could afford their exorbitant cost and flaunt their global connections. Imagine your senses accustomed to the subtle earthiness of grains and the occasional bitterness of wild greens. You wouldn't recognize the pungent warmth of black pepper, the sweet complexity of cinnamon, or the fiery kick of ginger. These weren't just flavorings. They were commodities traded across vast distances, often weighing more than their equivalent in gold. The Crusades had opened European eyes to these distant treasures, but their rarity and expense meant they were strictly the preserve of kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants. You can almost feel the longing, though perhaps unconscious, for a taste of something truly exotic. The lord of the manor, by contrast, would have access to these precious imports. His table would be graced with dishes seasoned with liberal amounts of chas, pepper cloves, nutmeg, and mace. These weren't just for flavor, they were also a conspicuous display of wealth and power. To serve a dish heavily spiced was to announce your status, your ability to command trade routes and pay for these luxury goods. For a peasant, even catching a faint whiff of such aromas from the manor house kitchens would be a rare and unforgettable experience, a scent of a world utterly separate from your own. Historians still argue whether the medieval nobility used spices primarily for flavor for their perceived medicinal properties or simply as a blatant display of wealth. Your peasant's diet, by necessity, relied on far simpler, locally sourced flavorings. You might use wild herbs, like thyme or marjoram grown in your small garden or foraged from the local woods. Onions and garlic, if you could grow them, would provide a sharp bite. The occasional splash of vinegar, if you made your own from spoiled ale or cider, might add tang. But these were humble, earthy notes, a world away from the vibrant symphony of flavors that spices could create. The most exciting spice you might encounter was the subtle, smoky flavor of a dish cooked over an open wood fire. The lack of spices also highlights the monotony of the peasant diet. Without these powerful flavor enhancers, every meal day in and day out tasted largely the same. It required a palate accustomed to simplicity, a body that valued calories and bulk above complex gastronomic experiences. The idea of adding a pinch of a costly foreign ingredient to your pottage would be laughable, a frivolous waste of precious resources. So as you consume your unspiced lunch, you truly grasp that spices were more than just a culinary ingredient in the medieval world. They were a symbol of power, a testament to global reach, and a stark reminder of the immense chasm between the lives of the peasantry and the nobility. Your world of food was defined by survival and local availability, a world where exotic flavors remained tantalizingly and utterly out of reach. Having accepted the absence of exotic spices, you begin to understand that the medieval peasant's palate was fundamentally different from your own. Theirs was a world where the subtleties of basic ingredients, often unmasked by strong seasonings, reigned supreme. You now immerse yourself in the far flavors of simplicity. Recognizing how their senses were attuned to very basic earthy tastes, finding richness in what you might perceive as blandness. Imagine biting into that dense, dark bread. To a modern palate, it's dry, rough, and perhaps a bit sour. But to the medieval peasant, it was the taste of sustenance, the deep, satisfying flavor of grain, perhaps, with a faint whisper of smoke from the communal oven. This wasn't merely absence of flavor, it was a profound appreciation for the intrinsic taste of staple foods. You might find a subtle sweetness in a perfectly ripe wild apple, a sweetness far more intense to a palate unaccustomed to refined sugars. The pottage, too, held a particular earthy flavor. Whether made primarily from oats, barley, peas, or beans, its long simmering would develop a deep, umami-rich base. The occasional addition of wild herbs or a few garden vegetables would provide fleeting notes of freshness or pungency, but the core taste would always be one of wholesome cooked legumes and grains. This was the taste of reliability of food that would fill your belly and sustain your body through long hours of labor. You can almost feel the comforting warmth of the pottage, a direct connection to the earth's bounty. Their diet was a study in variations on a theme. The main flavors were those of the grains, the legumes, and the seasonal vegetables. Differences were subtle, the slightly nuttier taste of barley versus the stronger, earthier flavor of rye, the sweetness of fresh peas versus the chalky earthiness of dried beans. These were not complex flavor profiles, but they were deeply understood and appreciated by those who lived off the land. This attuned palate meant they found satisfaction in very simple distinctions, tastes that would be utterly lost on someone used to strong, immediate flavors. Historians still argue whether the medieval palate developed a heightened sensitivity to subtle nuances of natural flavors or simply learned to tolerate monotony out of necessity. The lack of refrigeration also meant that any fresh items were consumed immediately, offering a fleeting moment of pristine flavor that would have been highly valued. A freshly picked wild berry or a raw onion would provide a sharp, immediate taste experience, a stark contrast to the cooked-down monotony of daily fare. These were cherished, almost luxurious moments of pure, unadulterated flavor. So as you chew thoughtfully on your peasant's lunch, you begin to appreciate the flavors of simplicity. You learn that satiety isn't just about calories. It's about a deep connection to the food you consume, understanding its origins, and finding contentment in its unadorned earthy taste. It's a profound shift in perspective, revealing a palate shaped by necessity, resilience, and an intimate relationship with the land. With your palate now attuned to the earthy, subtle flavors of medieval staples, you turn to the practicalities of consumption. You quickly notice a striking absence, a familiar item that defines modern dining nigh. Utensils absence. For the medieval peasant, forks were a futuristic concept, and even spoons were often a luxury, meaning your meal was primarily a hands-on experience, relying on fingers, a personal knife, or the communal wooden bowl. Imagine reaching for your chunk of bread and the thick pottage. There's no gleaming silverware, no neatly arranged set of implements beside your plate. Your most reliable tools are your ear fingers. You learn quickly to break off pieces of bread and use them as a scoop or a pusher for the thick pottage. The warmth of the food, the slight stickiness of the grains. You feel it directly, a visceral connection to your meal. This isn't considered crude, it's simply how food is consumed. You quickly adapt to this direct approach, developing a certain dexterity in handling your humble fare. Your personal hard knife, often tucked into your belt, is a multi-purpose tool. It's used for cutting your bread, preparing any meager vegetables you might have, or even if you're lucky enough to have a piece of cured meat, slicing off a thin portion. This knife is less about fine dining and more about practicality and survival. It's a constant companion indispensable for daily tasks including eating. You learn to handle it with care, as it's likely the only personal cutting implement you own. Historians still argue about the precise design and commonality of personal knives among different peasant classes, as archaeological evidence varies. For the pottage, a shared shakta wooden bowl might be placed in the center of the small gathering, whether in the fields or in your hut. Each family member might take turns dipping their spoon, if they possessed one, or simply scoop directly with their piece of bread or a piece of bark or a carved piece of wood. Spoons, while known, were often made of wood and might be communal or treasured, personal possessions not universally abundant. The idea of individual servings on separate plates with individual sets of cutlery simply didn't exist for the vast majority of the population. This communal approach to eating reinforced family bonds and shared hardship. Cleanliness by modern standards was a far lower priority. You'd likely wipe your hands on your rough clothing or a bit of straw between bites. The concept of germ theory was centuries away, and while people understood cleanliness as a general principle, the practicalities of daily life meant quick, functional eating. You don't linger over your meal. You consume it efficiently, knowing that precious daylight hours are slipping away. So, as you deftly manage your meal with your fingers and knife, you understand that the absence of modern utensils isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's a fundamental aspect of medieval peasant dining. It highlights a pragmatic, no-frills approach to food consumption where efficiency and utility trumped decorum, and every bite was a direct, tangible connection to the earth that provided your sustenance. With your fingers still a little sticky from the pottage, you notice the silent ritual unfolding around you. Meals for the medieval peasant weren't solitary affairs. They were deeply embedded in the fabric of their social world. You are now experiencing communal eating, understanding how meals were almost always shared, reinforcing family bonds and the collective nature of their challenging existence. Imagine your small family unit perhaps gathered inside your smoky hut, if the weather is inclement, or more likely huddled together in the fields under the open sky. There's no concept of dining alone. The same few humble dishes, the dense loaf of bread, the large wooden bowl of pottage, are laid out for everyone. Each person reaches often simultaneously for their share, a silent acknowledgement of mutual dependence. This isn't just about sharing food. It's about sharing the burden of survival, the scarce resources, and the fleeting moments of rest. You can almost feel the elbow of your sibling or child brushing against yours as you all reach for the common fare. This communal approach was born of necessity. Few peasant households had enough individual dishes or cutlery for each family member. A large, sturdy wooden bowl for the pottage, perhaps a rough wooden trencher, a thick slice of stale bread, or a wooden plate for personal bread, and a shared drinking mug were common. Forks, as you know, were non-existent. This practical reality forced a collective approach to eating, making mealtime a tangible expression of family unity. Historians still argue about the precise etiquette, if any, that governed peasant communal meals, given the general absence of formal rules. Beyond the immediate family, communal eating extended to the broader community. During peak harvest times, when laborers from different households might work together in the Lord's fields, meals could be shared among a larger group. This was a chance for limited interaction, perhaps a shared grumble about the weather, or the Lord's demands, reinforcing the bonds of village life. It was a moment where the lines between individual struggle and collective effort blurred, sustained by shared sustenance. The social implications were profound. Eating together fostered a sense of belonging and mutual support. It taught children about sharing from a very young age, a crucial lesson in a society where individual survival often depended on community cooperation. There was a direct visual accountability. Everyone could see what everyone else was consuming, reinforcing the idea of fairness even in scarcity. You wouldn't find a family member hoarding a special treat. What little there was for all. So, as you share your simple lunch with your family, feeling the warmth of their presence and the quiet rhythm of shared consumption, you understand that communal eating was more than just a logistical convenience. It was a cornerstone of medieval peasant life, a powerful ritual that bound families and communities together, reinforcing their collective resilience against the relentless demands of their world. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of scarcity, there was always room for connection. As you participate in the quiet ritual of communal eating, your gaze naturally falls upon the youngest members of your peasant family. You quickly observe that while they share in the meager fare, there's a subtle yet crucial difference in children's tiny portions. Their diet, though fundamentally similar to the adults, is carefully managed, ensuring they receive vital shares of the precious limited sustenance. Imagine the smallest hands reaching for a piece of bread or a spoonful of pottage. You notice that adults, despite their own gnawing hunger, will often instinctively ensure the children get their share first, or that their portions are slightly more accessible. This isn't out of boundless generosity in an abundant world, but out of grim necessity. Children were the future labor, the continuity of the family line, and their survival was paramount. A sick or stunted child could mean disaster for the family's ability to cultivate land and pay dues in the years to come. You can almost feel the quiet determination of a parent ensuring their child gets enough, even if it means less for themselves. The core components of their midday meal remain the same: bread and pottage. Chucked. However, the bread might be slightly softer, perhaps soaked longer in broth to make it easier for young teeth to manage. The pottage might be made with more easily digestible grains or legumes if such a choice was available. Infants would continue to be breastfed for an extended period, often for several years, providing them with essential nutrients and immunity in a world fraught with danger. Weaning would be a slow, gradual process, transitioning to thin gruels and soft bread cautiously. Historians still argue about the average age of weaning in medieval peasant communities, with practices likely varying by region and custom. While adults might drink small ale or weak cider, children would receive even weaker versions, often diluted with water, or simply water that had been boiled and allowed to cool. The emphasis was on hydration and very minimal calories from the beverage, not on any intoxicating effect. The goal was to keep them healthy enough to grow and eventually contribute to the family's labor force. The absence of nutrient-dense foods like meat, dairy, and fresh fruit for children was a significant factor in high infant and child mortality rates. While parents did their best, chronic malnutrition and vulnerability to common childhood diseases were constant threats. Rickets caused by vitamin D deficiency and various forms of stunted growth were unfortunately common. You see the quiet resignation in the eyes of parents, knowing that despite their best efforts, many children might not survive to adulthood. So as you watch the children consume their tiny portions, you understand that their meal, while seemingly meager, was a precious, carefully guarded investment in the future. It highlights the desperate struggle for survival where even the smallest mouths required vital shares of the limited resources, demonstrating the poignant realities of a medieval peasant's daily fight against hunger and uncertainty. As you observe the meticulous rationing of food, even for the smallest members of your peasant family, a stark and inescapable truth becomes overwhelmingly apparent. The calorie deficit. Your medieval body, constantly performing grueling physical labor, is running on an alarmingly low fuel gauge, rarely receiving the immense energy it truly needs to sustain such an arduous existence. Imagine your body as an ancient, incredibly inefficient human engine. It needs a massive amount of fuel to operate. Modern estimates suggest that a male peasant performing heavy agricultural labor would require anywhere from $3,000 to 5,000 calories per day, depending on the intensity of the work and the season. A female peasant often involved in equally demanding chores, both in the fields and at home, would require similar, if slightly lower amounts. Now look at your lunch, a chunk of dense, coarse bread and a bowl of watery pottage. You can feel the calories, but it's a far cry from what your body is truly burning. The problem wasn't necessarily a complete absence of food, but a consistent chronic shortfall. While you might consume a significant volume of bread and pottage, these foods, though filling, were often low in fat and protein, the most calorically dense macronutrients. The grains provided carbohydrates, which are essential for immediate energy, but without sufficient fats and proteins, your body struggles to repair itself and maintain long-term stamina. It's like trying to run a marathon on sugar water. You get a quick burst, but no sustained power. You can almost feel the deep-seated fatigue, a weariness that sleep only partially alleviates. This calorie deficit meant that your body was perpetually in a state of energy conservation. Growth was stunted, physical development was often incomplete, and recovery from illness or injury was slow and arduous. Every movement, every task drew directly from your precious limited energy reserves. This wasn't a choice. It was a constant battle against the limitations of your diet and the demands of your life. Historians still argue about the precise caloric intake of medieval peasants, as records are scarce and often rely on extrapolations from food production. The effects of this deficit were cumulative. Over days, weeks, and months, the constant energy shortfall would manifest as chronic fatigue, reduced muscle mass, and a pervasive lack of vitality. You wouldn't have the boundless energy often seen in modern, well-nourished individuals. Even simple tasks could feel monumental. This underlying caloric inadequacy made peasants particularly vulnerable to illness and dramatically shortened their lifespans. So as you swallow the last mouthful of your humble lunch, you understand that the problem isn't just the lack of variety or flavor. It's the profound, persistent calorie deficit that silently yet relentlessly shapes every aspect of your medieval existence. Your body is a testament to endurance, a living machine constantly operating below its optimal capacity, fueled by the bare minimum needed to simply keep going. The constant gnawing of the calorie deficit inevitably leads to a more insidious problem that plagued the medieval peasant: malnutrition's shadow. This wasn't always about outright starvation, though famine was a terrifying, ever-present threat. More often, it was a chronic state of dietary inadequacy, leading to a host of health issues that silently yet relentlessly eroded their vitality and shortened their lives. Imagine your body as a machine running on perpetually low fuel, but also lacking vital spare parts. While bread and pottage provided bulk and carbohydrates, they were often severely deficient in crucial vitamins, minerals, and high-quality protein. This invisible hunger, where the body craved nutrients it never received, manifested in a variety of debilitating ways. You wouldn't feel a sudden dramatic collapse, but a gradual, insidious decline. You can almost feel the dull ache in your joints, the subtle weakness in your limbs, even when you're ostensibly fed. One common ailment was anemia. Caused by a lack of iron. Your diet, heavily reliant on grains and legumes with limited meat, meant you were constantly struggling to produce enough red blood cells. This would lead to pervasive fatigue pallor and a reduced capacity for physical work, creating a vicious cycle where your inability to work efficiently further limited your food intake. Even the simplest tasks would feel profoundly exhausting. Vitamin deficiencies were also rampant. A lack of vitamin C found in fresh fruits and vegetables could lead to scurvy, causing bleeding gums, muscle weakness, and extreme fatigue. While scurvy is often associated with long sea voyages, milder forms would have been common in winter when fresh produce was non-existent. A lack of vitamin D due to limited sun exposure in northern climates during winter, and possibly a lack of dietary sources like fortified foods or fatty fish, could lead to rickets in children and bone softening in adults, affecting their ability to bear weight and making labor even more painful. Historians still argue about the precise prevalence of specific vitamin deficiencies, as definitive diagnostic methods from the era are scarce. Protein deficiency. Despite the legumes in pottage was also a constant concern. Plant-based proteins, while valuable, are often incomplete unless carefully combined. Without consistent access to meat, eggs, or dairy, your body struggled to repair tissues, build muscle, and fight off infection. This weakened immune system made peasants highly susceptible to common illnesses, transforming a simple cold into a potentially life-threatening ordeal. You'd witness how seemingly minor infections could quickly spiral into fatal conditions for those already weakened by their diet. The cumulative effect of this chronic malnutrition was a significantly reduced lifespan. While acute diseases like plague caused sudden dramatic deaths, the underlying dietary deficiencies made peasants constantly vulnerable. They aged prematurely, succumbed to illnesses more easily, and lived lives that by modern standards were short and marked by chronic discomfort. So as you feel the subtle symptoms of a body perpetually running on empty and lacking essential building blocks, you truly grasp the pervasive shadow of malnutrition that loomed over every medieval peasant. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about enduring a life where your very physical being was subtly yet relentlessly undermined by the limitations of your daily bread and pottage. As you grapple with the pervasive shadow of malnutrition, you also realize that the medieval mind, lacking modern scientific understanding, often held unique and sometimes entirely erroneous. Dietary misconceptions. Their beliefs about food and health, while born from observation and tradition, sometimes led to practices that from a modern perspective might seem counterproductive or even baffling. Imagine sitting by the fire, listening to the elders discuss remedies and dietary advice. Their understanding of the body was governed by the theory of the four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors, and food was seen as a way to restore balance. Certain foods were considered hot or cold, wet or dry, and were prescribed or avoided based on a person's perceived humoral constitution or the nature of their ailment. For instance, a person thought to have too much cold phlegm might be advised to eat hot foods like ginger, though you as a peasant wouldn't have access to ginger. You can almost hear the earnest yet ultimately unscientific medical advice being dispensed. This humoral theory profoundly influenced their dietary choices, often overriding practical nutritional concerns. A food might be avoided not because it lacked nutrients, but because it was thought to upset the humoral balance. This meant that even if a rare, nutrient-rich food was available, it might be overlooked due to medieval dietary dogma. Historians still argue whether the humoral theory offered any actual, albeit coincidental, health benefits through varied food consumption or primarily led to dietary restrictions without clear nutritional basis. Another misconception was the idea of digestion as a cooking process within the stomach. Food, particularly meat, was thought to literally cook inside the body. This belief sometimes led to preferences for pre-digested or highly cooked foods, like the long-simmered pottage, as they were believed to be easier for the stomach's internal fire to handle. Raw foods, while occasionally foraged, were often viewed with suspicion, considered difficult to digest and potentially disruptive to the body's internal workings. You might occasionally eat a raw berry, but a large uncooked vegetable salad would be unthinkable. There was also a strong belief in the archa, a hierarchy of foods. Foods from the earth like roots and grains were considered coarse and suitable for peasants. Foods from the air like birds and water like fish were seen as lighter and more refined, suitable for the nobility. This social stratification of food wasn't just about availability. It was deeply ingrained in their cultural understanding of nutrition and status. Your peasant's meal was not just what you could afford. It was what was deemed appropriate for your station. These dietary misconceptions, while often charming in their historical context, highlight the vast chasm between medieval and modern nutritional understanding. They remind you that even the most basic act of eating was filtered through a complex web of beliefs, traditions, and superstitions, shaping a diet that by modern standards was a constant struggle against hidden deficiencies and misguided principles. With the medieval understanding of health and food now apparent, you can appreciate the profound relief and stark contrast offered by the rare moments of abundance. Harvest feasts contrast. These joyous, if fleeting, celebrations after a successful harvest were a stark departure from the daily monotony, offering a glimpse of what a truly plentiful meal could look and taste like for the peasant. Imagine the end of summer, the fields finally cleared of their golden bounty. The air, usually filled with the scent of toil, now carries an aroma of celebration, perhaps roasting meat, freshly baked bread, and something sweet. The Lord, in a rare act of generosity, might provide a feast for his tenants as a reward for their grueling labor. This wasn't charity, it was a strategic investment in morale and a demonstration of his beneficence. For you, the peasant, it was a profound reprieve. You can almost feel the lightness in your steps, the sheer excitement building in the village. At these feasts, the usual strictures of your diet were temporarily lifted. For one glorious day, meat might be plentiful, perhaps a roasted pig, a sheep, or even venison, if the Lord was feeling particularly generous and you had helped with the hunt, would be served. You would finally get to sink your teeth into tender, juicy flesh, a taste and texture utterly alien to your daily fare. This wasn't just a few scraps, it was a proper portion consumed with gusto. The richness of the fat, the satisfying chew of the muscle. It would be a sensory explosion for a palate accustomed to blandness. Historians still argue about the precise frequency and generosity of these harvest feasts, as they likely varied significantly by manor and lord. The bread would be finer, perhaps even made with a higher proportion of itiaup, wheat flour, making it lighter and more palatable. There might be idun, fresh vegetables from the recent harvest, cooked simply but in larger quantities, and crucially there would be porridges, ale drunk more freely. Then during workdays, its higher alcohol content, though still not extreme, allowing for a rare loosening of inhibitions and a sense of joyous abandon. You might even see a form of dairy. Perhaps some fresh cheese or a churn of butter for this one special occasion. These feasts were not just about food, they were about community and celebration. Villagers would gather, share stories, sing songs, and momentarily forget the hardships of their daily lives. The communal aspect of eating, usually a necessity, became a joyous choice, reinforcing bonds and providing a vital psychological release. The sheer abundance, even if temporary, was a powerful symbol of successful collective effort and a momentary taste of a better life. You would savor every mouthful, knowing that this lavishness was a rare, precious gift. So while your usual peasant's lunch was a testament to scarcity and endurance, the harvest feast stood in stark, glorious contrast. It was a brief, shining moment of plenty, a reminder of what sustained effort could achieve, and a vital psychological balm that helped carry you through the long, lean months ahead. It was a taste of what you couldn't have daily, but what you worked tirelessly to earn. From the brief, glorious indulgence of the harvest feast, you're now brought back to the grinding reality of daily survival, a reality that occasionally and precariously involved Lord's leftovers. While certainly not a regular occurrence, the slim chance of receiving scraps from the manor's table offered a rare and often crucial, albeit humiliating, supplement to a peasant's otherwise meager diet. Imagine the bustling activity of the Lord's kitchen, a scene of opulent excess that contrasts starkly with your own humble hearth. Rich aromas of roasted meats and fine breads waft out tantalizing scents that you only rarely encounter. After the Lord and his household have feasted the remnants of their meals, bones picked clean of most meat, stale chunks of fine white bread, perhaps a few untouched vegetable peels, or the dregs of a rich sauce would be gathered. These weren't the generous portions of a modern doggy bag. They were truly scraps, often indistinguishable from actual refuse to an untrained eye. You can almost feel the faint longing as the rich smells drift past you, a reminder of what you lack. The distribution of these leftovers, if it happened at all, was entirely at the Lord's discretion. It was typically an act of charity, a paternalistic gesture designed to reinforce his authority and demonstrate his benevolence rather than a right. Peasants might wait patiently outside the manor house, hoping for a meager dole. This ritual, however infrequent, served as a powerful reminder of the social hierarchy, a stark visual of the vast gulf between the Lord's overflowing table and the peasant's perpetually empty stomach. Historians still argue about the frequency and quantity of such charitable distributions, as practices varied widely between manors and individual lords. When a peasant family did receive such scraps, they were treated as an absolute treasure. A single bone still clinging to a sliver of marrow or a thread of meat could be boiled down for hours to extract every last bit of flavor and nutrition, making a thin broth to flavor pottage. Stale white bread, though fine by the Lord's standards, would be a luxurious treat for a peasant offering a welcome change from the coarse, dark rye. Every morsel was carefully utilized, nothing wasted. You would chew slowly, savoring every faint taste of richness. This reliance on potential scraps also highlights the precariousness of the peasant's existence. Their very survival could in small part depend on the whims and generosity of their overlord. It fostered a dynamic of dependency and submission, where even the promise of a bone could ensure loyalty and discourage dissent. It was a subtle yet effective form of social control. So, as you reflect on the distant memory of a rare piece of boiled bone or a chunk of finer bread received from the manor, you understand that the Lord's leftovers, while meager, were a powerful symbol. They were a fleeting taste of luxury, a crucial supplement to a diet always on the brink of deficiency, and a stark reminder of your place in the rigid social order of the medieval world. Moving from the infrequent, sometimes demeaning handouts from the manor, you now focus on another critical, often contentious element of a peasant's daily struggle for sustenance: the village mill. This seemingly mundane structure was, in reality, a vital bottleneck in the food chain, a source of both necessity and often exploitation, profoundly shaping the bread that formed the core of your peasant's lunch. Imagine the constant drone of grinding stones, a low rumble that was the sound of your daily bread being made. The village mill, powered by water or wind, was the sole means by which raw grain, your hard-won harvest of wheat, rye, or barley, could be transformed into flour. Without the mill, your grains were largely useless for making the dense bread and pottage that constituted your entire diet. It was an indispensable piece of technology, a monument to practical ingenuity that dictated the very texture and availability of your food. You can almost feel the fine dust of flour settling on your clothes as you approach the mill. However, the mill was almost invariably owned by the plant's lord of the manor. This meant that you, the peasant, were legally obligated to bring your grain to his mill to be ground, and for this service you had to pay a fee known as the miller's toll. This toll was typically a portion of your grain or flour, often a substantial one, sometimes as much as 1/10 or even 1/16 of the total. This deduction levied on your already meager harvest represented a significant loss of potential food for your family. It was a constant source of resentment, a visible reminder of your economic subjugation. Historians still argue about the precise fairness and commonality of millers' tolls across different medieval regions as local customs varied. The miller himself, often a relatively prosperous figure due to his position, was also a frequent source of complaint. He had a reputation sometimes well-deserved for dishonesty, for taking more than his fair share, or for grinding the grain poorly, leaving too much bran or foreign matter in the flour. You would eye him with a mixture of necessity and suspicion, knowing that your family's sustenance depended on his honesty and skill. The loud clatter of the millstones could sometimes mask the sound of a miller's extra scoop disappearing into his own sack. The quality of the flour itself also mattered. The peasant's flour was typically coarse, dark, and unrefined, containing much of the bran and germ. This made for very dense, heavy bread, which, while nutritious and filling, was a far cry from the fine white flour reserved for the Lord's table. The milling process was less about producing pristine flour and more about processing bulk efficiently. So as you visualize your precious sack of grain being carried to the village mill, you understand that this was more than just a place where grain became flour. It was a focal point of economic control, a place where your sustenance was diminished by fees and potential deceit. It profoundly shaped the bread that formed the very foundation of your medieval peasant's lunch, reinforcing the constant invisible pressures that squeezed every calorie from your struggling existence. Having navigated the practical and economic challenges of the village mill, you are now acutely aware of the sheer unyielding effort required just to put that coarse bread and bland pottage into your mouth. This brings you to a profound realization. A peasant's endurance wasn't merely a virtue, it was the absolute bedrock of survival, a testament to the human body's incredible capacity to persevere on such meager fare. Imagine waking before dawn, day after day, year after year, with a constant ache in your muscles and a gnawing emptiness in your stomach. You are a living testament to resilience. Your body, despite being constantly underfueled, pushed to its physical limits, and vulnerable to unseen diseases, somehow keeps going. This isn't about choice. It's about an inherited, deeply ingrained capacity for hardship. You move with a purpose, each step economical, every swing of the scythe precise, driven by an instinct for self-preservation that transcends modern understanding. You can almost feel the rhythmic, unwavering beat of your heart, a steady drum against the backdrop of constant toil. The sheer volume of physical labor, as we discussed earlier, is immense. But combine that with a diet that barely meets your caloric needs, let alone provides abundant micronutrients, and you begin to understand the extraordinary endurance required. Your body learns to operate on a minimal input, prioritizing essential functions over growth or robust health. This leads to a particular kind of physical conditioning, lean, wiry strength, capable of sustained repetitive tasks, but without the explosive power or quick recovery of a well-nourished athlete. You might not lift the heaviest weights, but you can work tirelessly from sunup to sundown. Historians still argue whether the apparent physical strength of medieval peasants, despite their diet, was a result of natural selection or simply constant lifelong exertion. This endurance isn't just physical, it's also mental and emotional. Shaktiskum. Facing constant hunger, the threat of disease, the demands of the Lord, and the vagaries of weather, a peasant had to possess an incredible psychological fortitude. There was no room for self-pity or despair. The focus was always on the next task, the next harvest, the next meal. This unyielding spirit born of necessity is as much a part of their survival as the meager calories they consumed. You learn to block out discomfort, to push past fatigue, to find a quiet strength within yourself. The very concept of comfort food as an indulgence, a pleasure, is alien. For the peasant, food was comfort, but only in its ability to quell hunger and provide enough energy to keep going. The satisfaction came not from gourmet flavors, but from the simple fact of having eaten, of staving off the most immediate pangs of hunger for a few more hours. So, as you reflect on the ceaseless grind of medieval peasant life and the remarkably sparse lunch that fueled it, you gain a profound respect for their endurance. It highlights a human capacity for survival that most of us living in an age of abundance can barely comprehend. Their lives were a testament to the raw, unvarnished power of human resilience against overwhelming odds. From the incredible endurance of the medieval peasant, you are now abruptly brought back to your own reality, to the present day, and prompted to undertake a profound mental exercise. Modern comparison. Look at your own lunch, or simply imagine what you might typically eat for a midday meal, and contrast it sharply with the meager medieval offering. The differences are not just stark, they are almost unfathomable. Imagine your typical lunch today, perhaps a sandwich with various fillings, a crisp salad with a range of fresh vegetables, and a flavorful dressing, a warm bowl of soup, or even a prepackaged meal from a local cafe. You probably have access to lean proteins like chicken, fish, or tofu, a variety of dairy products, fresh fruits from around the world regardless of season, and a pantry full of spices to elevate flavors. Your drink is likely clean, potable water from a tap, or perhaps a sweetened beverage, coffee or tea. You eat with gleaming cutlery from a clean plate, perhaps while sitting in a temperature-controlled environment. You might even snack before and after, or consider what you eat for lunch in the context of your overall diet and fitness goals. You can almost feel the softness of modern bread, the crispness of fresh lettuce, the burst of flavor from a perfectly ripe tomato. Now hold that image against the medieval peasant's lunch, a chunk of dense, coarse bread and a bowl of thick, often bland pottage, made from boiled grains and legumes. No meat, no dairy, no fresh fruit, unless it was fleetingly in season, and foraged no exotic spices, and a murky low-alcohol ale as your drink. You eat with your hands, perhaps using a knife on the bare ground, exposed to the elements, acutely aware of the dust and insects. Your concern isn't about macros or micros, but about simply getting enough calories to avoid collapsing before sundown. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of such stark dietary differences was greater than the physical ones when considering societal happiness. The differences extend beyond the food itself. Your modern lunch is a choice. The peasant's was a necessity. You eat for enjoyment, for fuel, for social connection. The peasant ate almost solely for survival. You might grab a quick bite between meetings. The peasant took their most substantial meal as a vital break from unrelenting physical labor. The very concept of flavor is different. You seek complexity and variety, while the peasant found satisfaction in the sheer presence of sustenance. This modern comparison is not meant to cast judgment on the past, but to underscore the incredible abundance and convenience that define our contemporary lives. It highlights the sheer caloric and nutritional luxury we experience daily, a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the vast majority of people throughout history. It makes you pause and truly appreciate the ease with which you can acquire and consume food, something the medieval peasant fought for with every fiber of their being. So as you reflect on the stark contrast between your world and theirs, you realize that the medieval peasant's lunch wasn't just a meal. It was a testament to a life lived on the very edge of subsistence, a constant struggle against hunger deficiency, and an unyielding physical reality. It makes you deeply consider the true meaning of sustenance. Having journeyed deep into the medieval peasant's world and sharply contrasted their meager fare with your own abundance, you now come to a final profound reflection. Lessons from the Past. The medieval peasant's diet, far from being just a historical curiosity, offers powerful insights into human resilience, the true value of food, and the incredible progress that has shaped our modern lives. Imagine looking at a simple loaf of dark coarse bread, not with pity, but with a newfound respect. It represents not just calories, but unyielding resilience. It's a testament to millions of individuals who day after day, year after year, pushed their bodies to the absolute limit on what we would consider a survival diet. Their ability to extract life from the soil, to thrive or at least endure on such simple, repetitive fare, speaks volumes about human adaptability. It reminds you that our ancestors weren't weak. They were incredibly tough, forged in the crucible of constant physical demand and dietary constraint. You can almost feel the calluses on their hands, the stoop in their shoulders, a silent monument to their enduring strength. The medieval peasant's diet also forces you to confront the true value of food. In a world of scarcity, food wasn't just fuel, it was currency, a source of power, a marker of status, and a constant preoccupation. Every grain, every vegetable, every rare morsel of meat was precious, meticulously managed and consumed with profound intention. This contrasts sharply with our modern tendency towards food waste, where abundance can sometimes lead to a casual disregard for the sustenance we so easily acquire. The peasant's constant hunger highlights the fundamental human need for nourishment and the sheer effort historically required to obtain it. Historians still argue whether the consistent struggle for food in medieval times led to stronger community bonds or exacerbated internal village conflicts. Furthermore, this journey underlines the remarkable progress of modern society. The access to diverse, nutritious, and safe food that we take for granted today is a historical anomaly. Clean drinking water, year-round fresh produce, varied proteins, and a sophisticated understanding of nutrition were utterly beyond the wildest dreams of a medieval peasant. Your ability to choose what to eat, when to eat, and how to prepare it is a profound privilege bought by centuries of agricultural innovation, scientific discovery, and economic development. So as the last images of medieval fields and humble meals fade from your mind, let them leave you not with a sense of grimness, but with a deeper appreciation for the simple act of eating. The peasant's diet, in all its stark simplicity, teaches us about the extraordinary strength of the human spirit, the fundamental importance of sustainable practices, and the immeasurable value of the food security we now enjoy. It's a humbling, yet ultimately hopeful lesson from the past. The fields are quiet now, the sounds of medieval toil replaced by the soft hum of the fan. The taste of coarse bread and bland pottage recedes, leaving only the memory of a journey well traveled. You've walked in the footsteps of those who built the past, fueled by endurance and simple sustenance. Let the stillness of the night settle around you, knowing that history holds countless stories, each one a whisper guiding you gently towards rest. Sweet dreams.